Martin Luther King Jr. Faith and Radical Nonviolence, to be delivered by a dear friend of mine, Peter Muste. Peter is a lifetime UU. He attended RE and was active in the First Unitarian Church of Columbus, Ohio. He is currently a member of another UUCC, the UU Congregation of the Catskills in Kingston, New York. He is a member of the board of directors of the A.J. Muste Memorial Institute, an organization that was founded after A.J.'s death by several of his co-workers at the War Resisters League and named in his memory. The Institute supports grassroots, nonviolent organizing and activism in demilitarization, social justice, and labor rights. Peter is one of A.J. Muste's grandchildren and currently works as a public school teacher in upstate New York. Please welcome Peter Muste.
Good morning, and thank you to the worship committee, and especially to my dear friend Andy Fagan for inviting me to be part of the service this morning. As a way to mark the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I've been asked to speak about my grandfather, A.J. Muste, his relationship with Dr. King, and the impact of his philosophy of radical nonviolence on King and on the civil rights movement as a whole, and perhaps on how those ideas are relevant today. I'd like to begin with a quotation from Dr. King, who was speaking to Nat Hentoff, who at the time was writing what was to be the first published biography of A.J. He said, and I quote, "I would say unequivocally that the emphasis on nonviolent direct action in the civil rights movement is due more to A.J. Muste than to anyone else in the country." As Andy mentioned, this morning's service also references our sixth principle, whose sentiment I believe both men shared. To be clear, I am not, nor have I been, a professional activist. My chosen career was in the theater, which, by the way, is how I met Andy. And as he said, I currently work as a public school teacher in upstate New York. I'm one of A.J.'s 8 grandchildren. I do serve on the board of the Muste Institute, but that is not my subject this morning. A.J. Muste was born in 1885 in Zierikzee, the Netherlands, into a strict Dutch Reform family. He emigrated to the United States with his family, passing through Ellis Island and settling in Grand Rapids, Michigan, with other relatives and Dutch immigrants. Although his father had been a coachman, there were several ministers in his family tree, so it apparently surprised no one that both he and his brother Cornelius, or Neil, were ordained, Neil in the Dutch Reformed Church, and A.J. initially as a Presbyterian. His strong belief in the values expressed in the U.S. Constitution and the idea of democracy that it embodies led him, perhaps ironically, to the writings of Karl Marx and other socialist leaders, notably Leon Trotsky. So his biography traces him from being the minister of a small congregation in suburban Boston to leading the Lawrence, Massachusetts textile workers strike, which was one of the earliest successful strikes in the U.S. labor movement, to becoming a Gandhian pacifist and Quaker during World War I, to becoming a Trotskyite, and eventually, while en route to meet with Trotsky himself, having a religious experience in a church in Paris that led him to return to pacifism and to the church and to reject communism. He then co-founded the Brookworth Labor College, which educated members of industrial unions, both in the humanities and about effective labor organizing, and eventually returning to lead the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a Quaker-led organization that he helped co-found and has worked for peace and social justice since 1915. Perhaps a crooked path, but one with some consistent threads, and probably much the same could be said about my talk this morning. But what does all of this have to do with Martin Luther King? Various people who've written about A.J. have described the dialectic that he lived between two powerful convictions that he held. One was peace or nonviolence, a reverence for life, and the other was social justice, a recognition that a system that oppresses one group and advantages another is inherently violent. These two ideas were inextricably linked for him. There was no true peace without justice for all, and there was no true justice that was achieved through violent means. The third leg of his philosophy, and one that I think is crucial to understanding his work and his life, is his Christian faith and what he thought it meant to be a Christian. And for him, that meant focusing not on salvation or the kingdom of heaven, but on the teachings of Jesus and on trying to live by them. As he wrote in 1943, I was brought up to abhor the sham that allows a man to preach what he does not try desperately to practice. So if we look at Dr. King's work and life, I think it's easy to see those three themes reflected very clearly. Reverence for all life, the commitment to social justice, both of those underpinned by a powerful faith. So now to turn my earlier question on its head, what does that have to do with AJ? The two first met either in 1947 or 1949. Sources disagree on the year. But in any event, at the time, Martin, who was then a divinity student at Crozer Theological Seminary, attended a lecture given by AJ at the suggestion of one of his professors. At the time, King was not a pacifist, believing that war, and I quote, could serve as a negative good in the sense of preventing the spread and growth of an evil force, end of quote. Following that lecture, it's reported that King engaged in a lively debate with AJ. And while he wasn't won over at that moment, he later credited AJ his commitment to Gandhian practice and his, quote, hard-headed arguments as one of the primary influences that led him to a commitment to nonviolent direct action in his own work. After that, the two held each other in high regard for many years, and AJ certainly recognized King's power as a leader early on. Following a 1958 assassination attempt on King, AJ wrote to him, above any other man, Negro or white, you are now inevitably the instrument both to break down the color bar in this country and to reconcile and heal the people involved in the tragic situation which now obtained. For his part, for AJ's 80th birthday celebration in 1965, King's message to him read, you have climbed the mountain and have seen the great and abiding truth to which you have dedicated your life. Throughout the world, you are honored as our most effective exponent of pacifism. You have been a good friend and inspiration to me and to the whole nonviolent movement. Without you, the American Negro might never have caught the meaning of true love for humanity. So how did that happen? Well, King and AJ remained friends and often invited each other to be part of public events that they were involved in. Much of it happened through people who worked as advisors to King, who had either been sent by AJ and the Fellowship of Reconciliation to support various actions. And the most significant of these were George Hauser and Bayard Rustin. Both of them had worked with AJ at the FOR and had been involved in early nonviolent civil rights organizations, such as the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and both of them worked extensively with Dr. King. Bayard and his relationships with both King and AJ is a particularly interesting story, and he has been the subject of books, plays, documentaries, graphic novels, and currently a biopic which is being produced by the production company owned by the Obamas. Bayard Rustin was a black Quaker, highly charismatic, blessed with a beautiful singing voice, and openly gay in an era that, when that was, to put it mildly, not considered an asset. He was mentored by AJ, and the two maintained a close friendship despite a number of conflicts throughout the years. Through the 1940s and into the 1950s, the two worked very closely together, so aligned in their thinking that they were dubbed by some colleagues Muste and Rusty. Rustin rose to a leadership position in the FOR, despite repeated instances of having his work undermined by public exposure, of his having had or solicited sex with other men. Then in 1953, he was arrested, I believe in Los Angeles, in a car with two other men, which was the last straw for the FOR Executive Council. He was then asked to step down, and it was AJ who delivered the message. This incident has allowed some writers to make AJ the villain of the piece, painting him as the inflexible, homophobic, older white authority figure, intolerant of Bayard's sexuality. And to be fair, it makes for a good story. The The reality is somewhat more complex. First, AJ and the FOR had been aware that Bayard was gay for some time, and AJ had warned him that further public controversy could lead to his loss of a leadership role. The objection here was less to his sexuality in itself than to the fact of his arrest on morality charges, which undermined the organization and its credibility. This is not to suggest that AJ was particularly accepting of Bayard's homosexuality at the time. He had castigated Bayard strongly when his affairs with men were used to discredit his work against segregation and militarization, and he publicly expressed a wish that Bayard would abandon that lifestyle. There's also ample evidence that AJ's attitudes evolved over time, and less than 10 years later, he expressed the idea, both in writing and publicly, that his Quaker community needed to rethink its attitudes towards love and to accept each other as they were, rather than seeking to change them. But more significantly for the purposes of this morning's conversation, AJ never lost respect for Bayard's abilities, and their personal ties remained close and strong. So in 1956, when the young Dr. King was trying to organize the bus boycott in Selma, Alabama, the two people who AJ sent to assist him were Bayard and Reverend Glenn Smiley. And this was the beginning of a series of projects that Rustin worked on with King. And Smiley himself noted that, and I quote, "Rustin stands alone in his impact on King personally, through the many contacts both outside Montgomery and in the years following 1956, end of quote. Most notable of these is Rustin's work on the 1963 March on Washington that was the scene of the famous I Have a Dream speech. Now that event was the culmination of a series of protests that began in 1941 as the brainchild of A. Philip Randolph, who was an early civil rights and labor leader. The March on Washington movement, as it was then known, had consisted of a series of demonstrations both in Washington and other cities throughout the U.S. Its stated aim at the time was to end segregation in the U.S. military and in the defense industry during World War II. But the initial protest was abandoned when FDR signed an executive order ending, at least on paper, segregation in firms that supplied the U.S. military and officially in the armed forces. AJ, Bayard, and many others were dismayed by this and felt that an opportunity to push for more and stronger government action was wasted. But Randolph canceled the march because he felt that public opinion would no longer be with them. However, Randolph's movement evolved over the years. It included many demonstrations in D.C. and elsewhere. And then in early 1963, Randolph and others convinced Dr. King to be part of a planned, quote, March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And the wording of that official title is significant. I'll return to it in a bit. So along with James Farmer of CORE, another AJ disciple, the leaders of SNCC, including John Lewis and others, King and Randolph issued a public call for a march whose goals included a comprehensive civil rights bill that would do away with segregated public accommodations, protection of the right to vote, mechanisms for seeking redress of violations of constitutional rights, desegregation of all public schools in 1963, a massive federal works program to train and place unemployed workers, and a federal Fair Employment Practices Act barring discrimination in all employment. Lofty goals. They hope to have at least 100,000 people involved to help convince Congress and President Kennedy to take the issue seriously and to act on them. And it was an enormous organizational task and one that seemed daunting by any measure. The person they turned to organize that effort was Bayard Rustin, who had by then proven his ability to organize complex action, had tremendous charisma, and was well connected to most of the organizations involved in planning the march. But what he also had was the stigma of being an openly gay individual at the time. The appearance of strong moral character was deemed then as now as something essential to those seeking to change the status quo and their credibility, and Bayard's deviant lifestyle was a problem. They agreed that he was the man for the job, but also that he would work exclusively in the background. He would not speak at the event, and he would not be part of the public face of the march prior to it. Now, during the following months, Bayard and AJ remained in close contact. Bayard is quoted later as having said, "During all my work with Martin King, I never made a difficult decision without talking the problem over first with AJ." As we know, in the end, over 200,000 people gathered that August 28th, a hot, muggy summer day in Washington, for what was not merely the largest single protest action of the civil rights movement. It was also notable for what has been described as a picnic-like atmosphere. As buses, trains, planes, and automobiles brought the marchers to the Capitol. And aside from a few hiccups, like the march itself having to begin earlier than planned because of the extraordinary number of people who participated, the day went off largely without a hitch. I just want to take a moment to appreciate how remarkable it actually was. Over 200,000 people gathered in one place to protest grave injustices that had cost health, jobs, housing, even lives. And not only was there no confrontation with the peace, there was never even a real threat of violence breaking out. And it was a long day. There had been the march itself. There had been music provided by a variety of black and white performers, speeches, including a fiery, militant call to action from John Lewis of SNCC that had been toned down because it was considered too inflammatory by some of the organizers. And of course, the famous "I Have a Dream" speech that came late in the day. By many accounts, the audience was exhausted by then, hot and sweaty, many wilting in the August heat. But as we all know, what transpired was one of the most quoted speeches by an African American in U.S. history, and perhaps the signal moment of the civil rights movement. The following day in the New York Times, James Reston wrote, "Dr. King touched all the themes of the day, only better than anybody else. He was full of the symbolism of Lincoln and Gandhi and the cadences of the Bible. He was both militant and sad, and he sent the crowd away feeling that the long journey had been worthwhile." So where was AJ? I had wondered for years. I scanned photos of the march itself, of the dais during the speeches, of the event as a whole. I couldn't find any reference to his presence in any of the books that I read. And that somehow seemed inconceivable to me. Finally, last year, the last installment of a 4-part video documentary about AJ's life gave me the answer. He wasn't there. There had been discussion about including him. But by 1963, his focus was very squarely on nuclear disarmament and the Vietnam War, and on building coalitions devoted to ending the U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia. And it was felt that not only would his presence be a distraction from the primary agenda, which, again, was jobs and freedom, but that the presence of any anti-war speakers was unwelcome. And I think it's important to remember in the context that the roots had been planned in 1941 as protest against the exclusion of blacks from the defense industry and the segregation in the military. So sadly, AJ didn't get to hear that. Now, perhaps ironically, between then and his death in '68, Dr. King became more and more vocal in his stance against the Vietnam War, a fact which largely goes unnoticed these days. But some of his last writings and speeches are very explicitly and powerfully critical of the war, including the racism inherent in any colonial conflict and the high percentage of black young men who were drafted and dying in Southeast Asia. And this evolution was due in no small part to pressure from AJ's and others in the anti-war movement, including a young Vietnamese monk named Thich Nhat Hanh, who had been expelled from Vietnam for his anti-war work and who later was instrumental in arranging the trip to South Vietnam that AJ and several other pastors took in 1966. I'd be delighted to discuss further the relationship between King, Thich Nhat Hanh, and AJ Muste, but in the interest of time, I will pass over and just say that if people want to talk about that during the discussion after, I'm happy to do that. So in early 1966, AJ and several other pacifists journeyed to South Vietnam, where they were eventually ejected for protesting against the war there. Then, following a second trip to Vietnam later that year, during which, among other things, they met with Ho Chi Minh, AJ died of an aneurysm in early 1967. King, as we know, was assassinated about a year and a half later. I want to be clear, it is not my intent here to exaggerate my father's role in King's importance or his effect on the civil rights movement. Rather, I think the values and commitments that the two men shared are the real message for us today. As I said earlier, they shared a reverence for human life and a belief in the power of nonviolence, a passion for social justice, and true democracy. And this ought to bring to mind the sixth principle for us UUs, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. And I think it's worth remembering that some of the greatest achievements in freedom and justice were made by people like the man whose birthday we observed this weekend, through Gandhian commitment to treating even one's opponents with respect and dignity, the understanding that violence can only beget more violence, and trying to find a way forward that makes room for everyone at the table. We celebrate Dr. King's legacy in large part because he was able to successfully build a movement that mobilized hundreds of thousands of people over the span of a little over 10 years. And that success and his legacy is due in large part to his commitment to nonviolent direct action and to building broad coalitions based on shared goals and values, of moving beyond the violent pattern of domination and subjugation, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. I'd like to close now with one of AJ's favorite selections of poetry written by Stephen Spender. This is from his poem, The War God. Why cannot the one good, benevolent, feasible final dove descend, and the wheat be divided, and the soldiers sent home, and the barriers torn down, and the enemies forgiven, and there be no retribution? Because the conqueror is the victim of his own power, hammering his will out of fear of former, remembering yesterday when those he now vanquishes destroyed his hero father and surrounded his cradle with fabled anguishes. Today, his son of victory hides the night's anxiety, lest children of the slain prove dragon teeth, sown by their sun going down, to rise up tomorrow in sky and sea all blood, to avenge their fathers again. Thank you.